Night had fallen over Galway like a heavy curtain, and within the cold corridors of St. Brigid's Hall, the only presence besides the security guards was that of a man with slow, silent steps. Owen Callahan, with shoulders bent under the weight of years and unspoken sorrows. He pushed a bucket on squeaky wheels, cleaning the traces of an elite who didn't even know his name. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines that spoke of countless nights spent in these very halls, invisible to those who mattered. Behind him, without saying a word, his daughter Roisin walked like a shadow, sunken eyes, face too serious for her 14 years, and a worn rucksack that seemed to have been inherited from his own childhood. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 10 times, its brass pendulum catching the light as it swung back and forth with mechanical precision. Owen had been working these halls for nearly 2 decades now, ever since he'd left his dreams of becoming something more than a cleaner behind. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his nights polishing the floors where Ireland's future musicians learned their craft, whilst his own musical aspirations had been buried beneath the weight of responsibility and circumstance. Whilst Owen mopped the music room floor, the scent of lemon disinfectant mixing with the lingering smell of Roisin and old wood, Roisin slipped behind the auditorium curtain, where the yellow light of a rehearsal that had ended minutes before still remained. She sat on the polished wooden floor, as if she were at home, and observed the instruments on stage with the reverence of someone looking at something sacred. The grand piano dominated the center, its black surface reflecting the stage lights like a dark mirror. Violin cases lay scattered about, their owners having departed in the typical rush of privileged students eager to return to their warm homes and waiting suppers. It was at that moment that a group of students entered laughing, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. They wore the crisp uniforms of St. Brigid's, their blazers bearing the school crest with its intertwined harps and Celtic knots. These were the daughters of doctors, solicitors, and business owners, girls who had never known want, never understood what it meant to watch your father clean up after others. Without noticing her presence initially, they chattered about weekend plans and upcoming holidays to Paris or London. When they finally saw her, one of them, a blonde girl with perfectly straightened hair and a prefect's badge, called out loudly, "Who let you in here? Going to clean the floor with your da?" The laughter that followed rang louder than any note that had ever echoed from that grand piano. It was cruel, cutting laughter that seemed to slice through the air like broken glass. Roisin felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she didn't move, didn't speak. She simply sat there, absorbing their mockery like she had learned to absorb so many other humiliations in her young life. The scene was interrupted by Cleona Devane, a music teacher recently returned after a long leave. Her auburn hair was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under her green eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unresolved troubles. She looked at the girl with trained eyes, not of judgment, but of curiosity. The kind of look that musicians give when they hear something unexpected, something that doesn't quite fit the expected pattern. And then she asked, her voice gentle but firm, "Do you play?" Before Roisin could answer, Owen appeared at the door with his eyes ablaze, his cleaning trolley abandoned in the corridor behind him. His hands, still damp from the mop, clenched and unclenched at his sides. "She doesn't play. She's just waiting for me." His voice carried a finality that brooked no argument, but Cleona caught something else in his tone. Not just protectiveness, but fear. Cleona didn't insist, recognizing the wall that had suddenly sprung up between them. The laughing girls had already departed, their cruel entertainment concluded, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the echo of their mockery. But that night, returning to her classroom to collect some forgotten sheet music, she heard something that made her blood run cold and her heart race simultaneously. Music was flowing softly from the empty auditorium, not the hesitant, technical exercises of her students, but something raw, emotional, and utterly captivating. She stopped on the stairs, her hand gripping the worn wooden banister, and listened. What she heard wasn't from any student she knew. The melody was haunting, filled with a sadness that seemed to seep through the very walls of the ancient building. Each note carried the weight of something profound, something that spoke of loss and longing in ways that words never could. It was as if someone were pouring their soul out through the strings, using music as a language for emotions too deep for speech. The piece had elements of traditional Irish airs, but twisted and transformed into something entirely new, something that spoke of pain and beauty intertwined in ways that only true artists could achieve. The next day, Cleona called the administration and made an unexpected request. "I want Rosine Callahan to perform in this year's recital." And before the headmaster could laugh, she completed, "Because what I heard last night wasn't just music. It was the cry of someone who has been silenced." Owen was inconsolable. When he learned of Cleona's proposal, he slammed the staff room door with such force that a picture fell from the wall, its glass frame shattering across the linoleum floor like fractured dreams. The sound echoed through the corridor, causing several passing teachers to pause and exchange worried glances. He didn't shout. Owen Callahan had never been a man for raised voices, but his eyes said everything that his lips refused to speak. The fury in them was not the hot anger of the moment, but the cold, deep rage of a man who had spent years building walls only to watch someone threaten to tear them down. "You have no idea what you're doing," he whispered, grinding his teeth so hard that Cleona could hear the sound in the small, cramped room. His hands, those same hands that had spent decades cleaning and polishing, now trembled slightly as he spoke. The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across his face and making him appear older than his 52 years. Cleona, without being intimidated, replied firmly, "The only wrong thing here would be to keep that girl silent." She stood her ground, her own hands planted firmly on her hips, the way her mother had taught her to stand when facing down bullies in the schoolyard of her own childhood. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years coaxing music from reluctant students, someone who knew the difference between fear and stubbornness. And for the first time in their brief acquaintance, Owen appeared genuinely frightened, not of Cleona, not of the consequences of his outburst, but of something far more profound and dangerous. He was afraid of what Rosine's music might reveal, what secrets it might drag from the depths where he had buried them so carefully, so deliberately, so long ago. That afternoon, the autumn sun filtering weakly through the tall windows, Cleona took Rosine to a small room in the school's basement where they stored old instruments that had been deemed unfit for the main music program. The air down here was thick with dust and the smell of old wood and tarnished brass. Cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten sheet music, and the single bulb that illuminated the space cast long, dancing shadows across the accumulated musical debris of decades. She handed the girl a simple violin, used and battered, with strings nearly loose and a bridge that had seen better days. The instrument bore the scars of countless student hands, its varnish worn thin in places where nervous fingers had gripped it too tightly. It was the kind of violin that the school kept for beginners, for those who couldn't afford their own instruments, for those who didn't matter enough to deserve better. "Choose a melody," Cleona said, settling herself on an old wooden crate that had once held sheet music for the school choir. She watched as Rosine examined the instrument with the careful attention of someone who understood that music lived not in the quality of the tool, but in the soul of the player. Rosine didn't hesitate. She tucked the violin under her chin with the natural ease of someone who had been born to hold it, and began to play a sequence of notes that sent shivers down Cleona's spine like ice water in her veins. It was a strange piece, haunting and beautiful, with nuances that reminded one of traditional Irish music, the kind of airs that had been passed down through generations of storytellers and musicians who kept the old ways alive. But there were variations too complex for a girl of her age, modulations and harmonies that spoke of a musical education far beyond anything she could have received in her circumstances. The melody seemed to flow from some deep well of knowledge and emotion, as if it had been waiting inside her all along, needing only the touch of strings to bring it to life. Cleona found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sound might break the spell that seemed to have fallen over the dusty basement room. The music filled the space like water filling a vessel, touching every corner, every shadow, every forgotten dream that lingered in the accumulated silence of years. When the last note faded away, Cleona had to force herself to speak. "Where did you learn this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile magic had just been created. Rosine simply looked at her with those serious dark eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "I hear her singing to me at night," she said, as naturally as if she were discussing the weather or her schoolwork. Cleona returned to her home that night, a small flat above the bakery on Shop Street. But sleep eluded her completely. She spent hours searching through old sheet music, her fingers yellow with age from the ancient pages, until she found a passage almost identical to what Rosine had played. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the signature at the bottom of the manuscript, Sorcha Nim Haile. The name hit her like a physical blow. It was part of an unfinished composition, the handwriting elegant but hurried, as if the composer had been racing against time to capture something precious before it slipped away forever. Sorcha ni Maile, a name that many at the school pretended not to remember, a promising former student who had been removed from the institution years ago for what the official records termed incompatible behavior. When investigating the school's medical files, Cleona found Sorcha's dossier, diagnosed with creative delusions, institutionalized, quietly expelled, and, in the corner of the file, a sentence written by hand and partially erased, pregnant, composition inappropriately attributed. Cleona traveled to Ballina on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of day when the Irish sky seems to press down upon the earth like a lead blanket, promising rain that never quite arrives. The journey took her through countryside that had once been green and prosperous, but now bore the scars of economic hardship and emigration. Empty cottages dotted the landscape like broken teeth, their thatched roofs caving in and their gardens overtaken by brambles and wild grass. The building where Sorcha had been supposedly institutionalized stood like a monument to forgotten suffering. The old psychiatric hospital was abandoned now, its Victorian facade crumbling under the weight of decades and neglect. Ivy had claimed the red brick walls, creeping up towards broken windows that stared out at the world like empty eye sockets. The main gate hung askew on rusted hinges, and weeds pushed through cracks in the courtyard where patients had once walked in supervised circles, breathing what little freedom they were allowed. Local records had been scattered when the facility closed, but Cleona's persistence paid off when she tracked down Bridget O'Sullivan, a retired nurse who had worked at the hospital during Sorcha's time there. They met in a small cafe near the ruins, the elderly woman's hands shaking slightly as she stirred sugar into her tea with a tarnished spoon that had seen better decades. Sorcha? Bridget's voice carried the weight of memories she had tried to forget. Ah, the girl who sang to herself at night. Sure, we all knew her. She wasn't like the others, you understand. Most of the patients, they were lost in their own worlds, but Sorcha, she was trapped in ours. The old woman's eyes grew distant, looking past Cleona towards something only she could see. She would pace the corridors after lights out, humming melodies that none of us recognized. Beautiful they were, like nothing I'd heard before or since. The other nurses thought it was part of her condition, but I knew better. Those weren't the songs of madness. They were the songs of someone trying to remember who she was before the world told her she was wrong. Cleona leaned forward, her heart racing. Did she speak of anyone? A man, perhaps? Someone she cared for? Bridget's laugh was bitter, tinged with the regret of someone who had seen too much suffering and done too little to stop it. Oh, she spoke of him constantly. A man who had loved her, she said, but who had been forced to choose between her and his position, his reputation, his future. She never named him, but she would write him letters that were never sent, music that was never played. The doctors said it was all delusion, but she paused, taking a sip of tea that had grown cold while they talked. The night she disappeared, I was on duty. She came to me, as calm as you please, and asked if I thought love was worth dying for. I told her love was worth living for, but she just smiled that sad smile of hers and said some people weren't allowed to do either. When we checked her room the next morning, she was gone, just vanished. They said she'd been transferred, but no paperwork was ever found, no record of where she went. The revelation hit Cleona like a physical blow. She pressed for more details, but Bridget's memory was frustratingly incomplete. What she did learn was that Sorcha had been admitted not for any mental illness, but because her pregnancy had become inconvenient for someone with power, someone who needed her silenced. That same week, back in Galway, Roisin was helping her father clean the administrative offices after hours, when she discovered something that would change everything. Hidden behind a loose board in the old filing cabinet was a wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, she found a collection of items that spoke of a love affair conducted in secret and ended in tragedy. Letters tied with ribbon, their edges yellowed with age. Sheet music written in a delicate hand. Melodies that seemed to dance across the staves like captured butterflies. And at the bottom, carefully preserved, a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, standing beside a man whose face had been deliberately scratched out with such violence that the paper was torn. But it was the letter addressed to Owen, in Sorcha's careful script, that stopped Roisin's breath in her throat. The words seemed to leap from the page, carrying with them the weight of desperate love and impossible choices. My dearest Owen, if they succeed in silencing me, If the world forces us apart as I fear it will, know that what we shared was real and true and beautiful, regardless of what they say about it afterwards. I am carrying your child, our child, and though I know you cannot claim her publicly, I need you to promise me something. Promise me that you will watch over her, that you will teach her to hide if necessary, but never let her forget who she truly is. She will hear my voice in music, I know she will. The melodies I have written for her are hidden where only you will think to look. Guard them well, my love, for they are all of me that will remain. Roisin confronted her father that night, the letter trembling in her hands as she waited for him to return from his evening shift. When Owen saw what she held, his face crumpled like paper thrown into a fire. For the first time in her memory, she watched this strong, silent man break completely. He didn't deny it. How could he? The evidence was there in black and white, in his daughter's eyes that suddenly looked so much like Sorcia's, in the music that flowed from her as naturally as breathing. He told her everything, about the love affair that had bloomed in secret, about the pressure from the school administration when Sorcia's pregnancy became known, about the choice he had been forced to make between protecting his position and protecting the woman he loved. I was young and frightened, he said, his voice breaking like waves against stone. They told me she was disturbed, that the child would be better off without her influence. They promised she would be cared for, that it was temporary, just until after the birth. But when I went to find her, his words dissolved into sobs that seemed to come from the very center of his being. Roisin rose from the table, her young face set with a determination that made her look suddenly older than her years. Then it's time for everyone to hear her voice, she said, her words carrying the weight of a promise made to the dead. Cleona, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward, and it will be on that stage, with the same violin they used to silence her. The headmaster of St. Brigid's Hall, Martin Greaves, was a man who had built his career on maintaining the delicate balance between tradition and reputation. His office, lined with portraits of distinguished alumni and certificates of academic excellence, reflected his obsession with preserving the school's image as an institution for Ireland's cultural elite. When Cleona Devane marched into his domain with her proposal, his reaction was swift and brutal. Absolutely not, he declared, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had cowed parents and teachers alike for the past 15 years. His hands, soft from years of administrative work, drummed impatiently against the mahogany desk that had once belonged to the school's founder. She is not a matriculated student. She is not the daughter of tradition. She is the daughter of... He paused, searching for words that would express his disdain without crossing into territory that might later be used against him. She is the daughter of error. The words reverberated through the oak-paneled room like poison seeping into wood. Cleona felt her temper rise, but she had anticipated this response. She had spent the previous night researching not just Sorcia's story, but the intricate web of connections that had allowed it to be buried so effectively. What she had discovered would have made fascinating reading for the local press had anyone been brave enough to publish it. Then it will also be the stage for the scandal you buried, she replied, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her chest. She placed a manila folder on his desk, its contents carefully organized for maximum impact. Sorcia Nimhaili's medical records, the falsified reports, the payments made to ensure her silence, the composition credits that were reassigned after her convenient disappearance. Greaves's face went white, then red, then white again. He recognized some of the documents. How could he not? His own signature appeared on several of them, authorizing transfers of funds that had been carefully disguised as scholarships and administrative expenses. The young administrator he had been 20 years ago had thought himself clever, covering his tracks with bureaucratic efficiency. The man he was now realized how foolish he had been to leave any tracks at all. The tension in the school grew like a cancer over the following days. Some teachers supported Cleona in whispered conversations in empty classrooms, sharing their own memories of talented students who had been quietly discouraged or dismissed when their presence became inconvenient. Others, those whose positions depended on Greaves's favor, spoke loudly about maintaining standards and preserving the integrity of traditions that had served the school well for generations. Meanwhile, Roisin prepared for her performance with the focused intensity of someone who understood that this was about more than music. She practiced in the basement storage room, surrounded by broken instruments and forgotten dreams, her fingers learning to coax beauty from the worn strings of the violin that had once belonged to her mother. It was during one of these sessions that disaster struck. Arriving for her usual evening practice, Roisin found the violin lying in pieces on the floor, its strings cut with surgical precision, its bridge snapped in half. The beautiful instrument that had carried Sorcha's music through the years lay destroyed, its voice silenced as effectively as its original owner had been. Beside the wreckage lay a note, written in block letters that offered no clue to their author's identity. Phantoms don't perform. Return to the basement where you belong. The message was clear, but its delivery was a tactical error. By destroying the violin so publicly, so dramatically, the perpetrator had revealed the depth of their fear. Someone was terrified enough of what Roisin might say through her music to resort to sabotage, and that terror suggested guilt of the highest order. When Cleona discovered the destruction, her first emotion was rage. Her second was determination. She marched to her own office, unlocked a cabinet that hadn't been opened in years, and withdrew a violin case that bore the patina of age and careful preservation. Inside lay an instrument of extraordinary beauty, the violin that Sorcha herself had played during her brief, brilliant time at St. Brigid's. "This belonged to your mother," she told Roisin, her voice thick with emotion as she lifted the instrument from its velvet-lined case. "They kept it as evidence when she was taken away, then forgot about it when the scandal died down. I rescued it from the archives 5 years ago, thinking someday someone might need to hear her voice again." The violin was magnificent, its amber varnish glowing in the basement's harsh fluorescent light. Unlike the broken instrument that lay in pieces at their feet, this one sang with the authority of a master craftsman's work. When Roisin drew the bow across its strings for the first time, the sound that emerged was pure and powerful, carrying with it the echoes of every melody Sorcha had ever played. On the final night before the recital, Owen found his daughter in the practice room, tuning the precious instrument with the careful attention of someone who understood its true value. For the first time since she had learned the truth about her parentage, he looked at her without the weight of guilt that had burdened their relationship for so many years. He knelt before her, this man who had spent decades bent in service to others, and for the first time in her memory he spoke to her in the Irish tongue that had been his mother's language and his grandmother's song. "Mo Crowy," he whispered, the endearment carrying with it all the love and regret and hope that he had never been able to express in English. "Mo Crowy Beag, my little heart." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning years of silence and misunderstanding. Roisin understood then that her father's silence had never been about shame. It had been about protection, about a man's desperate attempt to shield his daughter from a world that had already proven itself capable of destroying what it could not control. Roisin rose to her feet, the violin cradled against her shoulder like a beloved child, and looked into her father's eyes with a steadiness that made her seem suddenly much older than her 15 years. "I'm going to play," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had finally found her purpose. "But not for me. For her, on the stage above them, already set for the next day's performance." The headmaster waited with a security guard, ready to prevent her entrance by any means necessary. In the grand auditorium of St. Brigid's Hall, the lights began to dim one by one, each extinguished bulb marking another step towards the evening's climax. The seats had been filled by Galway's most distinguished families, solicitors whose names graced brass plaques in the city center, doctors who had delivered half the children now performing on stage, businessmen whose donations kept the school's endowment healthy and their own consciences clear. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the rustle of silk dresses, the murmur of conversations conducted in the careful tones of people who understood that every word spoken here would be remembered and analyzed for weeks to come. The annual recital was more than a musical performance. It was a social ritual, a confirmation of status and tradition that bound Galway's elite together in their shared appreciation of culture and refinement. Parents sat with programs clutched in their manicured hands, mentally rehearsing the applause they would offer their children, the congratulations they would accept from other parents, the subtle negotiations that would take place during the interval over whiskey and wine. The stage itself was a vision of calculated perfection. White roses had been arranged in crystal vases at strategic points, their petals catching the stage lights like captured stars. The grand piano dominated the center, its ebony surface polished to such a high sheen that it reflected the faces of the young performers who waited in the wings, their nervous energy palpable even from the audience. But tonight there was an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with typical performance anxiety. Word had spread through the city's social networks like wildfire. There was to be a controversial finale, a performance that had not been officially sanctioned, but had somehow found its way onto the program. The final presentation of the night, according to the elegantly printed booklets distributed at the door, would be performed by a guest student. No name was given, no background provided, no explanation offered for this departure from tradition. When Roisin Callahan finally appeared in the wings, dressed in a simple gray dress that had been her mother's and carrying the violin that had once sung for Sorcia, the backstage area fell silent. The other performers, children whose parents had paid thousands for their musical education, stared at this girl who looked so ordinary, so unremarkable, yet who carried herself with a dignity that seemed to transform the very air around her. She walked with measured steps towards the stage, her dark hair pulled back with a blue ribbon that had belonged to Sorcia, her eyes focused not on the audience, but on some distant point that only she could see. In her hands, the violin seemed to glow with its own inner light, as if the years of silence had only served to concentrate its power, waiting for this moment to release everything it had been forced to contain. The murmur from the audience grew louder as she emerged into the lights. Whispers began immediately. Who was this girl? Why was she here? Some of the older attendees recognized Owen Callahan from their glimpses of him during his cleaning duties, and the realization that this was his daughter sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. Children of the working class simply did not perform at St. Brigid's recitals. It was an unwritten rule, understood by all and violated by none. Owen himself sat in the very back row, as far from the stage as possible while still being able to see his daughter clearly. His hands were clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Beside him sat Cleona, her own tension evident in the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her fingers drummed silently against her program. In the third row, Martin Greaves shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had considered having security remove the girl before she could begin, but something in Cleona's earlier threat had given him pause. The documents she had shown him were damning enough, but he suspected she had more ammunition in reserve. Better to let this play out and deal with the consequences later than to create a scene that might draw even more unwelcome attention. As Roisin reached the center of the stage, the lighting technician, following instructions that had been slipped to him by Cleona earlier that evening, brought up a single spotlight that illuminated her while leaving the rest of the stage in gentle shadows. The effect was dramatic, almost ethereal, as if she were standing in a pool of moonlight rather than under the harsh glare of theatrical lighting. She raised the violin to her shoulder with movements that seemed to flow like water, and for a moment the entire auditorium held its breath. Then she began to play, and the world changed forever. The first notes that emerged from Sorcia's violin were not merely music. They were a voice crying out across decades of enforced silence. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with pain and longing and a desperate kind of hope that seemed to reach into the chest of every person present and squeeze their heart until tears came unbidden to their eyes. This was no student recital piece, no careful exercise designed to showcase technical proficiency. This was music that spoke of love and loss, of dreams destroyed and lives discarded, of the terrible price paid by those who dared to love outside the boundaries set by society's guardians. Each note carried the weight of Sorcia's story, the truth that had been buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence and social propriety. In the stunned silence that followed the opening passage, an elderly voice rang out from the third row, clear and accusatory. That melody, it was stolen from her mother, and you all knew it. The speaker was Alice Greaves, the headmaster's own mother, her finger pointing directly at her son as the audience began to murmur and shift. And slowly, inexorably, members of the audience began to rise from their seats. The revelation that followed Roisin's performance spread through Galway like wildfire across drought-stricken bog. Within hours of the recital's conclusion, social media platforms were ablaze with discussions, arguments, and demands for justice. The video of Alice Greaves denouncing her own son had been captured on a dozen mobile phones and shared thousands of times before the sun rose on the following day. Local newspapers, initially hesitant to cover what seemed like an internal school matter, found themselves overwhelmed by reader interest and public pressure. The Galway Advertiser ran a front-page story titled "The Silenced Song," whilst RTA West dispatched their most experienced investigative reporter to dig deeper into the scandal that was rapidly consuming one of Ireland's most prestigious educational institutions. But it was the response from former students that truly opened the floodgates. Within a week of the recital, dozens of women had come forward with their own stories of harassment, discrimination, and systematic silencing during their time at St. Brigid's. The social media hashtag Dri or Sorchas song became a rallying cry for those who had been dismissed, discouraged, or destroyed by an institution that prized reputation over justice. Margaret O'Brien, now a successful solicitor in Dublin, shared her story of how her scholarship had been mysteriously revoked after she had refused the advances of a married teacher. Sarah Walsh, a doctor working in London, described how her academic achievements had been minimized and her contributions to school publications credited to male students. Emma Sullivan, who had left Ireland entirely after her experience at St. Brigid's, revealed how she had been expelled for moral misconduct after becoming pregnant at 17, whilst the father, a teacher's son, had faced no consequences whatsoever. Cleona Devane found herself at the center of a storm she had never anticipated. Her modest flat above the bakery became an impromptu headquarters for the growing movement, with former students arriving at all hours to share their stories and offer their support. The kitchen table where she had once graded papers was now covered with documents, photographs, and testimonies that painted a picture of institutional corruption spanning decades. The pressure on the school's administration became unbearable. Board meetings that had once been genteel affairs conducted over tea and biscuits now resembled war councils, with board members shouting accusations at each other whilst lawyers scribbled furious notes in the corners. The school's solicitors advised immediate action to distance the institution from the growing scandal, whilst public relations consultants recommended a strategy of controlled admissions and carefully crafted apologies. Owen Callahan, meanwhile, found himself in an impossible position. The revelation of his relationship with Sorcha had made him a figure of public sympathy, but also of intense scrutiny. Journalists camped outside his modest terraced house on Merchants Road, hoping to capture him coming or going, seeking quotes that might add fuel to the growing fire of public outrage. He responded to the attention in the only way he knew how, with silence and dignity. He continued to work his cleaning shifts at the school, even as protesters gathered outside the gates and television crews filmed his every movement. When reporters shouted questions at him, he simply nodded politely and continued on his way, carrying his mop bucket with the same quiet determination he had shown for 20 years. But the pressure was taking its toll. The man who had spent decades in the shadows suddenly found himself thrust into the harsh light of public attention, and the weight of years of suppressed guilt and shame began to show in his slumped shoulders and hollow cheeks. Roisin watched her father with growing concern, seeing how the revelations that had liberated her seemed to be crushing him under their weight. It was Cleona who suggested that Owen might find some peace in telling his own story, in his own words. Together, they spent long evenings in her flat, with Owen speaking slowly and carefully into a digital recorder, whilst Cleona and Roisin listened in supportive silence. The resulting testimony was devastating in its simplicity, the account of a young man caught between love and survival, who had made the wrong choice and spent 20 years paying for it. 3 weeks after the recital, Martin Greaves submitted his resignation to the Board of Governors. The official statement cited health concerns and a desire to spend more time with family. But everyone understood the real reason. The man who had built his career on maintaining the school's reputation had become its greatest liability. His departure was followed by a cascade of other resignations and dismissals. Teachers who had been complicit in the cover-ups found themselves without positions, whilst administrators who had falsified records faced potential criminal charges. The Board of Governors, many of whom had been members during Sorcha's time at the school, found their own positions untenable as the public demanded a complete overhaul of the institution's leadership. But perhaps the most significant change came from an unexpected source. Alice Greaves, the elderly woman whose public denunciation of her son had triggered the avalanche of revelations, approached Cleona with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "I want to make amends," she said, her voice shaking with emotion as she sat in Cleona's living room, surrounded by the detritus of the ongoing investigation. "My late husband left me comfortable, and I've spent too many years turning a blind eye to what my son was doing. I want to establish a foundation, the Sorcha Ní Maile Foundation, to help young musicians who might otherwise be silenced." The proposal was extraordinary in its scope. Mrs. Greaves was offering not just her financial support, but her social connections, her influence, and her determination to ensure that no other young woman would suffer Sorcha's fate. The foundation would provide scholarships, legal support, and most importantly, a voice for those who had been denied the right to speak. As the arrangements for the foundation took shape, Cleona made a discovery that changed everything once again. Hidden in a box of Sorcia's belongings that had been stored in the school's archives, she found an unfinished composition. On the cover, in Sorcia's careful handwriting, were the words, "For the daughter who will come after me." It was time for Roisin to complete her mother's final work. The new administration of St. Brigid's Hall, now operating under the watchful eye of a public oversight committee appointed by the Department of Education, moved swiftly to distance itself from the scandals of the past. The interim headmaster, Dr. Siobhan Kelly, was a woman of impeccable credentials and progressive ideals who had been brought in specifically to rebuild the school's shattered reputation and restore public confidence in its mission. It was Dr. Kelly who approached Roisin with an offer that seemed designed to put the entire controversy to rest. On a crisp October morning, she arrived at the Callahan home accompanied by two members of the school board, carrying with them a leather portfolio that contained what they clearly considered to be a generous and forward-thinking proposal. "Miss Callahan," Dr. Kelly began, her voice warm but carefully professional, "the school would like to offer you a full scholarship to complete your secondary education with us. Your performance at the recital demonstrated exceptional talent, and we believe that St. Brigid's can provide you with the musical education you deserve." The offer was indeed generous, not just tuition but books, instruments, private lessons with Ireland's finest music teachers, and even a modest living allowance to ensure that financial concerns would never interfere with her studies. It was the kind of opportunity that most families could only dream of, a pathway to a future that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. But there was a condition, delivered with the kind of diplomatic language that made its true meaning unmistakable. "We would ask only that you consider adopting a performance name, perhaps Roisin Maher, after your grandmother's maiden name. It would help to soften the historical associations and allow you to build your own artistic identity without the burden of past controversies." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Cleona, who had been invited to witness the meeting, felt her temper rise like mercury in a thermometer. She recognized the offer for what it was, not generosity, but a calculated attempt to buy Roisin's silence, to erase the inconvenient truth of her parentage and transform her from a symbol of injustice into a token of the school's newfound progressiveness. "You're still trying to bury her mother with pretty words," Cleona said, her voice cutting through the polite veneer of the meeting like a blade through silk. She rose from her chair, her green eyes blazing with an intensity that made the board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You want to give her everything Sorcia was denied, but only if she agrees to pretend that Sorcia never existed." Dr. Kelly attempted to maintain her diplomatic composure, explaining that the name change was merely a suggestion, a way to help Roisin move forward without being forever defined by tragedy. But her words only served to confirm what Cleona had suspected, that even under new management, St. Brigid's was more concerned with managing its image than confronting its past. Roisin listened to the entire exchange in silence, her dark eyes moving from face to face as the adults around her negotiated over her future, as if she were a piece of property to be bought and sold. When Dr. Kelly finally turned to her for a response, expecting gratitude and eager acceptance, Roisin's answer came without hesitation. "I don't want your scholarship," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I want justice for my mother." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief. Dr. Kelly recovered first, attempting to explain that the scholarship was justice, a recognition of talent that had been overlooked, an opportunity to right historical wrongs through future opportunities. But Roisin was no longer listening. She had made her decision, and with it, she had chosen a path that would lead her far from the comfortable compromises that institutions preferred. Instead of accepting the school's offer, she had already committed to something far more significant, a performance at the National Concert Hall in Dublin, as part of a concert celebrating young Irish musicians who had overcome adversity. The invitation had come through Cleona's growing network of contacts in the music world, teachers and performers who had been moved by Roisin's story and wanted to offer her a platform that came without conditions or compromises. It was to be a concert of firsts, first-time performers, first compositions, first opportunities for voices that had previously been silenced. More importantly, it would be the venue for the premiere of a work that Roisin had been laboring over in secret for weeks. Working with Cleona and drawing upon the musical fragments that Sorcia had left behind, she was composing something entirely new, not a recreation of her mother's lost work, but a response to it. a completion of a conversation that had been interrupted by tragedy. The process of composition had been both therapeutic and agonizing. Each note seemed to carry the weight of history, each melody a thread connecting past and present in ways that words could never achieve. Roisin found herself working late into the night, surrounded by sheets of music paper covered with corrections and revisions, trying to find the musical language that would honor her mother's memory, whilst asserting her own voice. As word of her decision spread, the response was immediate and polarizing. Some praised her integrity and courage, seeing in her refusal to compromise a nobility that was rare in a world of calculated accommodations. Others criticized her as foolish and ungrateful, throwing away opportunities that countless other young people would kill for. The night before her departure for Dublin, Roisin made a pilgrimage that she had been contemplating for weeks. Armed with a torch and her mother's violin, she made her way to the abandoned psychiatric hospital in Ballina, where Sorcha had spent her final months. The building was even more derelict than when Cleona had visited months earlier, its windows now completely boarded up, and its grounds overgrown with brambles and wild grass. But Roisin was not deterred. She found a way into the building through a broken window on the ground floor, moving carefully through corridors that still echoed with the ghosts of past suffering. When she found what she believed to be her mother's room, a small space with barred windows and walls stained by decades of neglect, she sat on the floor and began to play. The music that emerged was unlike anything she had ever produced before. It was a lament for all the women who had been silenced, a song of rage for all the talents that had been wasted, and a promise that their stories would not be forgotten. As the notes echoed through the empty building, Roisin felt a connection to her mother that transcended death, a sense that Sorcha was somehow present, lending her strength for the battle to come. When she emerged from the hospital as dawn was breaking, Roisin carried with her more than just her violin. She had found her mother's final composition, hidden in a loose brick in the wall of that forgotten room. And on the cover, in Sorcha's fading handwriting, was a title that took her breath away: The Daughter Who Was Never Welcome. It was time to give this song its first and final performance. Dublin in November carried the bite of winter in its wind, cutting through the streets like a blade sharpened on stone. The National Concert Hall stood like a beacon against the gray sky, its modernist facade a stark contrast to the Georgian elegance that surrounded it. Inside, the great auditorium was filling with an audience unlike any that had gathered for a classical music performance in recent memory. These were not the usual patrons of high culture, the wealthy donors and social climbers who typically filled such venues. Instead, the seats were occupied by survivors, women who had been silenced, students who had been dismissed, artists who had been told their voices didn't matter. They had come from across Ireland and beyond, drawn by word of mouth and social media campaigns, united by their shared experience of being deemed unwelcome in spaces they had every right to occupy. In the green room backstage, Roisin Callahan sat in quiet contemplation, now 16 years old and bearing the weight of expectations that would have crushed many adults. Her dark hair was arranged in a simple style that echoed her mother's appearance in the old photographs, and she wore a dress of deep blue wool that had been her mother's favorite color. In her hands, she held the violin that had become the symbol of everything she represented, not just musical talent, but the refusal to be silenced. Beside her sat Cleona Devane, no longer just a music teacher, but now the director of the Sorcha Haile Foundation, which had grown from Alice Greaves's initial donation into a movement that was changing lives across the country. The foundation had already provided scholarships to dozens of young musicians, legal support to women fighting institutional discrimination, and most importantly, a platform for voices that had been systematically excluded. Owen Callahan stood at the back of the green room, his presence both protective and deferential. The man who had spent decades in the shadows was still learning how to exist in the light, still grappling with the revelation that his silence, meant to protect, had instead perpetuated the very injustices he had hoped to avoid. But he was learning, and in his daughter's courage he was finding the strength to confront his own past. As the moment for her performance approached, Roisin felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders like a cloak. This was not just about music, though music would be her medium. This was about justice deferred but not denied, about the power of truth to outlive those who would suppress it, about the responsibility that came with being the vessel for voices that could no longer speak for themselves. The composition she would perform tonight was unlike anything in the classical repertoire. Working with the fragments she had discovered in her mother's hospital room, she had created something that was part lament, part protest, part celebration. It incorporated traditional Irish melodies that spoke of exile and return, but transformed them into something entirely contemporary, something that spoke to the experiences of anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. When the time came, Roisin walked onto the stage with the measured pace of someone who understood the gravity of the moment. The audience fell silent, not with the polite attention of a typical concert crowd, but with the hushed reverence of people witnessing something historic. At the center of the stage, a single spotlight illuminated her figure, whilst beside her stood an empty chair draped with a blue scarf that had belonged to Sorcha. She approached the microphone with the confidence that came not from arrogance, but from absolute certainty about the importance of what she was about to do. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the hall without amplification, trained through months of learning to project not just sound but meaning. "This music is for all the mothers who were silenced," she said, her words falling into the perfect acoustic of the hall, like seeds into fertile soil, "and for all the daughters who are still learning how to speak." What followed was not merely a performance, but a revelation. The music that flowed from Sorcha's violin was a conversation across time, a dialogue between mother and daughter mediated by melody and harmony. It began with the fragments that Sorcha had written in her final days, broken phrases that spoke of dreams deferred and love denied, but grew into something larger, something that encompassed not just one woman's tragedy, but the collective experience of generations of women who had been told their voices didn't matter. The audience listened with an attention that went beyond mere appreciation. Many were crying before the first movement ended, recognizing in the music their own stories of exclusion and dismissal, their own struggles to be heard in a world that preferred their silence. The melody seemed to reach into the chest of every person present and speak directly to their heart, validating experiences that had been dismissed as unimportant or imaginary. As the final notes faded into the cathedral-like space of the concert hall, the silence that followed was profound. This was not the pause before applause, but the moment of recognition that something irreversible had just occurred. Then, slowly, people began to rise from their seats, not in ovation, but in solidarity, a wordless acknowledgement that they had witnessed not just a performance, but a reckoning. Owen and Cleona watched from the wings as the audience rose as one, their silent standing a more powerful tribute than any applause could have been. In that moment, Cleona reached out and took Owen's weathered hand in hers, and he whispered the words that had taken him 16 years to find. "She is the best of both of us." When Roisin finally left the stage, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of a performance completed, but the knowledge that her mother's voice would never again be silenced. The music they had created together, across time, across death, across all the barriers that had been erected to keep them apart, would continue to resonate in the hearts and minds of everyone who had heard it. The Sorcha Ni Mihaile Foundation would go on to support hundreds of young artists, ensuring that no one would ever again face the choice between their voice and their survival. The scandal at St. Brigid's Hall would lead to reforms throughout the Irish educational system, creating protections and accountability measures that would prevent future cover-ups. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Sorcha and Roisin would become part of Ireland's cultural memory, a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that the voices of the silenced can speak across generations to demand the truth that was denied them in life. Go rive maith agat, as fea shant, liostai lehaghaith twilead.